Okay, good morning and welcome everybody to the second in our series of banking training sessions on restructuring. My name is Duncan Clubb. I'm from the BDO Sydney office. Joining me today is Shaun McKinnon from our Brisbane office and Mathew Blum from our Melbourne office. Topic today is assessment of solvency and how it impacts on financiers. So, hold on a second, technical issues. Go. Okay, so that's us. Yeah, this is what we're covering off on today. Basically, the definitions of insolvency, the tests for insolvency being cash flow, balance sheet, and other indicia, and then the financier's role and how do banks and other stakeholders have their actions influenced by solvency, and how does their actions influence solvency. So you may well be asking, well, how is all this relevant to me, given that I'm a banker and not a director? And kind of a valid question. Insolvency is a pretty dry topic, but Matt and Shaun will hopefully make it a little bit more interesting for us. But 2021, insolvency is never going to be more relevant. It's been an obviously unprecedented time, and doesn't matter if you're involved in the economy. You're going to be affected by solvency next year. We've all heard about zombie companies. We've all heard about the historic level of insolvency that occurred during 2020 in spite of the the recession and pandemic. And it's going to be inevitable that clients are coming to you as financiers looking for support, looking for assistance, and you're going to have to weigh up how you make the decision as to who you support and who you don't support. And the impact of those decisions will have an impact on insolvency. And then how can you use solvency to leverage the outcomes you want from the clients that you are dealing with? That's the other element to it. So it's going to be, elements of this are going to be dry, which I apologize for, but there's no getting around it. It's quite a technical topic. It's a topic that is a grey area, so there's no clear-cut answer. But there is just a process that we work through in terms of determining solvency. And it's something that, as I said, is never going to be more relevant than it will be in the next 12 months. And so that's the reason why we've decided to cover this off as a topic today. So with that, I'll pass over to Shaun, who will talk us through the methodologies and definitions associated with insolvency.
Thanks, Duncan. And hi, everybody. Welcome to this session today on how do you assess solvency. So look, my task is to sort of set the scene a bit, I guess, and I wanted to start by talking about the definition of solvency and how we go about, what's the methodology that we go about when determining solvency from a company's perspective. There's usually a couple of different ways or a couple of different times that we're asked to consider this, and it's either we're as an administrator or a liquidator and we're looking into doing investigations as to the date of solvency. It could be an expert's report for court, where we're looking at identifying a date of solvency. Or it could be a real-time situation where we're advising directors, and that's something we've seen a little bit of the last couple of weeks as we come to the end of the insolvent trading moratorium, where we're advising directors as to whether or not they're insolvent today. And they want to know that, obviously, because directors have a personal liability for trading whilst insolvent. So it's pretty topical for directors, especially independent directors that don't have their wealth tied up necessarily in the business that they're the director of. So when we're looking at how do you assess solvency, obviously starting point is the Corps Act. So we've got up there the definition under the Corps Act, which everybody's probably well aware of, and I'll just go over it very quickly. And under 95A, it says a person is solvent if and only if the person is able to pay all the debts as and when they become due and payable. And a person who is not solvent is insolvent. Now that's a pretty broad definition and not particularly helpful. It doesn't give us a lot of insight on its own as to how do we assess solvency. We've all seen plenty of companies over the years in business that have had a circumstance where they have been behind creditor payments. They might have extensive, say, 90-day creditors, ATO payments outstanding. But does that make them insolvent? Not necessarily. But how do we really determine that? How do we determine the difference between a short-term liquidity issue versus insolvency? So the courts have actually looked into this and have actually done quite a bit of work to help us determine that. We'll just jump forward to the next slide and we'll go through the three key tests that have actually been determined by the courts that you need to go through when considering solvency. So over the years, the courts have given us quite a bit of guidance, and they've come up with the following. Number one, a balance sheet test. This is pretty simple. It sounds exactly what it is. It's a review of the balance sheet. Do you have assets in excess of liabilities? And obviously, when assessing that, you need to do some work on what's really in those. The cash flow test. Do you have cash available to meet your liabilities as they're falling due? Now, the cash flow test obviously involves detailed assessment of the assumptions that underpin those cash flows, or the timings of cash flows if you're doing it in retrospect. And then finally, what we call the other indicia test. And other indicia can pretty much be anything else. It is typically, though, indicators of insolvency that you won't find in the financial statements. And I'll go through those in a minute. And in fact, over the course of this presentation, we'll look at each of these three tests in quite a bit of detail. What's important for you to know, though, is that individually these tests aren't indicators of themselves. Individual circumstances of companies need to be brought into account, and you need to look at all three. And the courts have done that, and they've given us a little bit of determination, a little bit of guidance in how we should do it. But Duncan, if you can just jump through to the next slide. So there's been a number of cases, and we've quoted just a couple of them here, which are probably the more widely quoted cases that talk about how do these different tests interact with each other. So in Bell Group, O&J stated, as we've got up there, neither test, balance sheet test and the cash flow test, is invariably accurate in ascertaining the true financial position of a company. Both have defects. One of the major problems with the balance sheet test is that not all the company's assets are severable or can be readily exchanged for money. Now, all he's really talking about here is the fact that you may have a lot of assets, but if you can't turn them into cash quickly to repay your liabilities as and when they fall due, then that doesn't necessarily mean that you're solvent. He went on to say that the cash flow test, on the other hand, has been criticised as being vague and uncertain and as posing difficult questions with regards to timing. And what he's talking about there is that whether we're looking at a cash flow test in retrospect, so think an expert's report for court several years after the event, or whether we're looking at it in real time, so think a director that comes to us today and says, can you help us understand if we're insolvent and whether or not we need to appoint an administrator, we have to make subjective decisions around the timings of different cash flows. And that of itself can be complex, and it can be quite difficult and open to a lot of interpretation. Now, O&J gave us some further guidance though around which of those tests should be the primary test. And ultimately it was the primary solvency test supported by the courts, not just in this case, but in many others, is the cash flow test. But O&J went on to say that the balance sheet test should not be dismissed as irrelevant, and it can provide contextual evidence for the proper application of the cash flow test. So really all we're saying here is that you can't look at one on its own, you need to look at both of them together. Now, if we jump forward one more slide, Duncan, we'll talk about an additional case, which was that of ASIC versus Plyman, where Mandy J set out a series of indicators which should also be considered when looking at solvency. Now, if you look at all of those on the list, and I won't go through each of them right now because I will talk about them a little bit later in some more detail when we talk about this test. But what I'd like to point out for now is that everything other than those first two bullet points are effectively what we call, I guess, qualitative issues. They're not issues that you can see from the balance sheet. And what you really need to understand is that if you are looking at the solvency of an entity, it's quite important to look at the holistic picture. The balance sheet and the cash flow are the two places that we always start, and they're very important. But on their own, they're not the only things that we look at. There can be other issues, such as those on the screen up here, that influence solvency. And there have been many circumstances in my career where I've looked at a particular business and had a different outcome after I've looked at the cash flow test and the solvent and the balance sheet test. So the outcome I get when I then take into account all of these other indicators. It's quite often that you can have a solvent company on the basis of the financials, but by looking at some of these other indicators, you could possibly have an insolvent company. And the one obviously, fourth point down there, which is relevant to those financiers on the call, is having a poor business relationship with your present bank, including the inability to raise further funds. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So look, that's sort of setting the scene a little bit. Really what I want you to take away from this as we move forward is that if you're looking to determine insolvency, there is actually a defined methodology that the courts have approved. It involves these 3 tests. Those 3 tests have to be looked at in conjunction and in the circumstances of the individual company, not in isolation. So with that, Matt, I'm going to hand over to you, and I think you're going to take us through the cash flow test.
Thanks, Shaun. So as Shaun's pointed out, over time, the cash flow test has evolved to be highly relevant in assessing company solvency. And if you take a simplistic view of the definition, can the company pay their debts as and when they fall due? A cash flow test basically tells you, in simple form, does it have the funds available to do that? Now, whilst that is a simple view to take, there are a number of strategies that an expert will go through to be able to assess that. So I'll cover off on that today. So what they will look at is, what is the existing cash flow that's been prepared? What reserves are there? Can they raise additional funds? So that might be via the financier. It could be asset realizations, although that can then flow into forecasts, as in if they're selling an income generating asset, that could also be detrimental. And then owner contribution, but being careful to be able to evidence that those owner contributions will come into fruition, which I'll talk about a bit further later. And then, of course, the key point is estimating what debts will fall due, when they will fall due, and then the timing of receipts. So that's obviously a very high level. We'll drill into how we would work through those issues over leaf. So firstly, before we look forward, we look back at the performance and prior cash flows to be able to assess what cash flow can the company rely on. So so in this instance here, we're looking at the operations of the business, how it's trending, what sort of net profits are available then to then manifest themselves in available funds down the track. Timing is highly important. It's amazing how many businesses we deal with that haven't actually built themselves a cash flow to be able to work out if they can pay their liabilities. But so that's typically the first step, is helping them to build a cash flow. But if they have already built a cash flow, a key element is testing the assumptions. So not just theoretical debtor receipts based on, say, 30-day terms. When do these debtors actually pay? And that's where the history of that particular debtor or the debtors across the board helps. Seasonality, highly relevant. We're coming into Christmas. How does that impact cash flow? If you're dealing with construction, you know, that'll typically push out receipts, and then what sort of wages will still be paid, to give you some basic examples. What has changed, highly relevant, and we'll talk about the impacts of COVID a bit later. But how does that affect? How has that affected sales? How will restrictions being lifted affect sales in the future? What about the customers? What their financial health? How will that have a flow-on effect? And then, of course, all the government relief. So it's not just a case of doing a theoretical cash flow where you start with the P&L and relabel it and take out accounting entries like depreciation. You've got to have a real assessment of what will actually occur. And then we'll talk a bit more about assumptions on the next page, but testing key timings like project completion dates and the like. So here we've got an example of how we might test the assumptions of a business, and I might need to wear your glasses to go through that, but we'll take my word for it. So forecasts of sales, you know, we've never seen a bad forecast, but testing the veracity of those numbers is important. So I'll go through a hypothetical example here. It's based on a real case, but obviously we'll keep the details confidential. But so in this instance, we tested the forecast of sales versus the historical sales. Yep, okay, they're in line. Given the nature of this business, they're not detrimentally impacted by the restrictions from the coronavirus. So that's a tick. So we in this instance say there's a low risk that their forecasted sales will be inaccurate. And if we're using a traffic light system, that's where you see that the green light. So cost of goods sold, in this instance, they forecasted that their cost of goods sold is going to be 3% lower than in the past. So that's where we look at the history to then assess the future. And depending on what rationale we are given for why that reduction will occur, that'll determine the level of risk. So if it's just an ambit 3% reduction, then okay, well, there's a risk that this may not occur. But if you're able to cite actual cost reductions in contracts and the like, then there might be you know, a little bit more, that forecast might be a bit more robust. Then debtor collections, are there timing, are the receipt timing from debtors realistic? So here we've seen that they forecasted that the debtors will be paying in 45 days, whereas on average they pay in 60 days in the past. So there's quite a real risk here that debtors aren't going to pay as quickly as they've forecasted, and that will then need to be adjusted when we perhaps restate the cash flow forecast, which I'll get into shortly. Operating expenses year on year, they're in line with historical numbers, green light. Checking a bit of due diligence around contracts. Are they just stating that they've got this work, or is there an actual contract that's already been signed, and can they rely on that work? Creditor payments, now there might be a little bit of flexibility here, but when will they pay, for instance, the ATO? Have they paid it down? Is there a scope for any arrangement? Is it necessary for any arrangement with creditors? And then things like extraordinary receipts or payments such as the JobKeeper. So here what we've done, we've gone through a cash flow that's been prepared by a client. We've tested the numbers and the assumptions, and in doing that, we've perhaps identified what a more realistic cash flow might look like, and that's where we then prepare, as part of our cash flow tests, what we think is a more robust assessment. So we go over the page. In this specific company, they had an overdraft, so that's why you see that shaded orange area there below the zero. So an overdraft is important when assessing solvency. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. You look at an overdraft like it's a liability. So in this case, the company at any time could have had up to a $500,000 liability. And so whilst your first reaction might be liability is not bad, a liability is bad for solvency. In this case, it actually presents itself as available funds. So that overdraft, although detrimental to a balance sheet, is actually a positive on a cash flow, from a cash flow test perspective, because it's $500,000 in available funds that the company can use to meet their debts as and when they fall due and payable. So you can see that the chart across the screen dips below the zero into that overdraft facility, where in that orange section. That top line there is the client's forecast that they've prepared. And then once we've tested the assumptions, we can see that it might be a bit optimistic. So they dip into the overdraft once they hit midway through the month, and then they utilise overdraft in and out for the rest of the month. Now then, once we've taken a more realistic view of some of their assumptions, say for instance, great example, debtor days, they've said debtors will be paying within 45 days, whereas the more realistic number is 60 days. You can see that all of a sudden they don't have the funds available that they would need to pay the liabilities that are due. And so there you see the line drop below the overdraft to say that, right, well, they're paying out more cash than they've got available. Then the question presents itself, well, how are they going to do this? And therefore, are they actually insolvent? So that test, and it might be something that an accountant helps with, or it could be an expert, obviously something that we're experienced with. That's actually quite important, because then all of a sudden you've got a bit of foresight and you can start to think about, well, what needs to be changed? What do we need to deal with here to make sure the company is solvent in the future? So if we go through some of those examples on our next sheet here, we've got, if you can just flick over, thank you. A common example of how a company and a director might say that, well, they can trade through these issues is with financial support that they might be putting in themselves, related party loans. Now, it's not, in assessing the solvency, it's not enough to just say, yes, I'll put some money in and the company will be fine. It's actually quite important to demonstrate that those funds are available. There might be some correspondence or contractual commitment, but in a liquidation scenario in particular, it's quite important to demonstrate a history of it. So where these related parties can show that, well, they've always been able to tip money in to the company to help it pay its debts, and they can point to these transactions and these loan balances, that can actually help demonstrate solvency. But if once a company ends up in liquidation, these related parties say, oh, it was always fine, we were always going to help pay the debts, but didn't, that won't stack up. Other support, which is obviously highly topical in this session, is what support will a financier offer? Obvious impacts there. The sale of assets, and speaking to a number of financiers, this is perhaps a strategy that's not utilised enough, where and you know, citing human nature, that a business has collected these assets and they're a little bit hesitant to sell off some of their machinery, for example. I'll give you experience firsthand. We were dealing with a manufacturer that had large lathes. Each lathe was worth 500,000, not like CNC machines, worth 500,000 each. Collected 8 of these, and 2 or 3 of those machines would always sit unutilized at the back of the warehouse. And he was just very hesitant to sell it because it was his pride and joy. And but had he sold those machines over time, he would have been able to get a good realisable value for it rather than a for sale, and it would have supported cash flow of the business through a downturn, or in this instance they were automotive business, and it would have enabled him to restructure his customer base to more military and aviation, which the business only got part way through doing. So realising assets seems to be counterintuitive, but it's something that should be looked at. But just stating that these assets could be sold may not help. You have to also look at, well, what income do these assets present? So if I give you a very simple example, this company is solvent because it's got $1 million business. I could sell this $1 million business and pay down the debt of the same amount, but unfortunately, if you sell this $1 million business, then obviously the revenue forecasts will go off a cliff. So if taking the commercial reality into consideration is important. Creditor deferrals, obviously a very real option to be explored. Typically, if a company is already experiencing financial difficulty, they've probably already taken up this option, whether it's by arrangement with the creditor or just unilaterally by paying them at a later date. In this specific case, what we were able to identify was that this company was paying their creditors within 40 days on average, and the industry average was actually 60 days. So what we could see there was that there was an opportunity for greater terms. And what is really important from a solvency perspective is that these payment arrangements are documented and agreed to. So then what you're doing is you're shifting a due date. So rather than paying a creditor at the 60-day mark when your terms are at 40 days, you want to make sure those terms are rearranged to 60 days, and therefore those debts are being paid on time, and then coming back to that definition of insolvency as and when they fall due. Operational and restructuring strategies. Now, these can present some instant wins, or it may be a more long-term investment where you know, we might work with a client to look at their margins, look at their profitability. Again, we're talking about a cash flow test, but if a business has continuing losses, it's going to manifest itself in poor cash flow being available down the track. So there's some of the opportunities there. So by preparing that forecast, they've seen that there's a need to rectify the situation and then start exploring those opportunities. If they hadn't prepared that forecast, then they may not have ever fixed that situation. They would find themselves with an overdraft that's in default, and then all of a sudden an unhappy financier. And I'll come back to talk about the impacts on financiers later. Next, Duncan. And then, so cash flow tests, obviously highly relevant, and then we'll go into a balance sheet test next.
Thanks, Matthew. The balance sheet test is obviously all about the balance sheet. So, as Shaun sort of touched on before, you know, I guess the primary test has historically been the cash flow test, but it needs to be considered in conjunction with the balance sheet test. Balance sheet is going to be interesting in the next 12 months because, you know, we're finding that businesses are coming out of the COVID environment, and, you know, revenue is returning to somewhat of a more normal level. Yet we're seeing reliance on JobKeeper drop off as people fail to qualify for JobKeeper any longer, which is positive because obviously revenue is returning. But what we're finding is that they're coming through into 2021 with a balance sheet which is just really congested with accrued liabilities because, you know, they've been deferring their interest and they've been deferring their rent. They've not had to pay their employees. They've not been paying the tax man. So the balance sheet is just really loaded up with liabilities, which means that if you look at it from a purely balance sheet test perspective, which is do your assets exceed your liabilities, allowing for contingent liabilities and prospective liabilities? You know, do you have more assets than you've got debts or liabilities? And that's going to be a challenge for a lot of businesses because, you know it's got that congestion from the last 9 months. So we really need to be aware of, you know, the risk that holds to solvency, but it's not the be all and end all, as Shaun and Matthew have covered off, because, you know, cash flow is also very important. So I just wanted to talk you through some of the things that we consider when we're looking at the balance sheet test in the context of next year we're going to see clients that have got balance sheets that look awful. So that's basically what we're at. We look at it from a perspective of ratio analysis. We look at current ratio. We look at the debt ratio. We look at the interest cover ratio. All things that you guys as financiers would be across. But those ratios are going to blow out because, you know, because of that, what I mentioned around, you know, the current liabilities, which will become current once the ability to the stimulus measures are unwound. So, you know, you've all of a sudden you've got creditors putting pressure back on because they're allowed to issue stat demands. The landlords and the rent deferral program, that's tailing off. So, you know, rent is going to become due and payable again. Plus, they're going to be responsible for the back rent. So that's going to blow out that current ratio. And the debt ratio is going to grow because they've not been making their interest repayments over the last period. And your ICR is, you know, is going to be, you know, contingent on a number of factors. But, you know, if your revenue is there, then, you know, it's not going to be as dramatically affected as the current ratio and the debt ratio. So that's, I guess, the top level when you're looking at your balance sheet. Covenants are going to be an issue, and obviously when we talk to a lot of financiers, they're obviously aware of this. They're getting on the front foot. They're issuing, they're allowing for variations in the terms of their financing contracts to accept the fact that these ratios are going to be distorted by virtue of what's happened over the course of the last 9 months. And that, from our perspective, also makes it challenging because, when we're doing these reviews, as Mathew touched on, we look at historical performance, we look at forecast performance, and historical performance is not going to be relevant because the economy going forward is in a dramatically different place. And forecast performance is going to be challenging because the economic climate is completely unprecedented. So how do you forecast for something that you have never been through before? So it's really interesting when you're running these tests to sort of think about it in that sort of context. So here we go, just on the balance sheet, we're looking at working capital, and you can see it over time. It's a fairly straightforward sort of analysis there. You've got your cash at bank, you've got your payables, you've got your receivables, you've got your overdraft limit, and that just brings out your working capital position. As the payables fall due, as people try and claw back the last 9 months, that working capital position is going to deteriorate. And it's going to be up to the financier to determine whether or not an increase in overdraft is an appropriate way of working through those facilities, working through that forecast period. We've got financiers who are going to have to make decisions around clients that they support and clients that they don't support. And this is pretty much it, case in point, is that their working capital position for a lot of businesses, as they clear that backlog of liabilities, is going to be really deteriorated. And the lender needs to take a view as to whether or not it's a short-term issue or it's a long-term structural issue with the business that can't be resolved because, for whatever reason, the business is fundamentally broken. So that's, I guess, the purpose and the relevance to the lender group around the balance sheet test as it comes to working capital. So again, we've got the primacy of debtors and creditors as it comes to the balance sheet test. When we're looking at solvency, we're looking at the timing of the age receivables, the receipt, and how that flows through. We're looking at the timing of the payables, the quantum of the payables, to work out whether or not our liabilities are in excess of assets or not. So nothing particularly else interesting there. And then I guess the other issue is that when we're looking at the balance sheet, cash movements that are almost hidden, I guess, in terms of where the money how the money moves through the group, whether you're in breach of your loan facilities, how you funding that principal repayment, what is the timing of your principal repayment, does that go back to the cash flow that Mathew was talking you through earlier? Capital expenditure, a lot of businesses are really going to struggle with their capital expenditure in the next 12 months because they're just not going to have that surplus cash. But it's going to be essential, as you're allowing for social distancing and adjusting your business to meet the new normal. And is that in their forecast? That is really all I've got to say on the balance sheet. So Shaun is going to talk us through the other indicia.
Thanks, Duncan. All right, so we've talked through the cash flow test, we've talked through the balance sheet test, and if you're still awake, now we're going to talk you through the other indicia test. And look, as Duncan said at the beginning of this, it's a bit of a dry topic, but this is the process of going through insolvency, and as insolvency practitioners, this is our life sometimes. So maybe not as
pleasingly, mate. No one's dropped off. We're still at 100% of original attendees, so it can't be as boring as we thought.
That's a good sign. So we've been through the cash flow test, we've been through the balance sheet test, and now we move on to other indicia. And I said at the beginning of this, when I started talking, that quite often what happens in those first two tests can be overturned effectively by individual issues that we see in the other indicia tests. Now, this list of tests here was provided by Mandy J in the ASIC versus Plum case, and it's actually been a really comprehensive list. I'll go through them briefly, but the first two, continual losses from trading and whether liquidity ratios are below 1, are both issues that you would see from your P&L or your balance sheet. But everything else are qualitative issues. So overdue Commonwealth and state taxes, think ATO, obviously. Understanding whether or not these are in fact behind, whether or not there's been any sort of repayment plans, are those repayment plans being adhered to, etc., is what we're talking about there. The fourth one, very topical for our financiers on the call, poor business relationship with the present bank, including the inability to borrow further funds. And look, this is a really topical issue. In fact, quite often we're looking at insolvency. The ability to leverage support from your bank is a critical factor in maintaining solvency, especially in periods of short-term liquidity. And I'll come back to an example of that in a minute. Not being able to access alternative finance. So that can be, alternative debt finance, equity. We're also talking about suppliers insisting on cash delivery or demanding special payments. So this is another thing that we as liquidators would look at when we're in a circumstance where we're actually going back and trying to review a solvency position, whether that be live or whether that be in retrospect. We look at some of these sort of non-financial factors, and if I can see that there is a pile of demands growing, there are a bunch of statutory demands, for example, or there's simply a series of letters demanding payment or putting people on cash on delivery, well, that's a pretty good sign that you're not paying your debts as and when they fall due. Unpaying creditors, obviously, where you're not paying your creditors on time, that's critical. The issue of post-dated checks. Now, this probably just demonstrates that this is quite an old case. Not a lot of people are paying by checks anymore. But what we would see in today's world would be return direct debits. The existence of special arrangements for selected creditors, so we're talking about repayment plans, etc. Provision of solicitor letters, summonses, judgments or warrants. So all we're really talking about here is any sort of demands for payment. An inability, finally, to prepare timely and accurate financial information. In fact, there is actually a presumption in the Corps Act that if you can't show accurate financial data, that you can be presumed insolvent. And the case here is never more relevant when considering solvency, is if you can't actually figure out what your financial position is, well then it's probably a good indicator that you're not in a very good financial position. Now, let me give you a couple of live examples of where this has sort of come in that I've dealt with in the past. So the first one I'm going to talk about was a concrete pumping business that I was the administrator of, and we were giving them some advice all the way up to the administration, as you normally do. Now, this particular business had accrued a significant ATO liability, and it was balance sheet insolvent. It had accrued that position through some failed investments, but the underlying profitability of the business was still really strong, and on a cash flow test, it was solvent. And when we were talking to that director, our view was they were solvent at that point in time. Over time, though, a particular investee company that they had invested in and had guaranteed a project for got into some financial difficulty. The guarantee was called, and once that guarantee was called, which I think from memory was about $14 million, was material enough to change the fact that they were no longer solvent, they were insolvent. And so that would sort of fall under the provision of solicitors' letters, summons, judgments, etc. But when that guarantee was called, it automatically changed the position from solvent to insolvent. Another job that I did was a expert's report for court in relation to a capsicum and watermelon farmer. Now, the court proceedings was actually between the farming enterprise, or the person that ultimately bought the action from a liquidator, but the farming enterprise had bought some seeds off a seed provider, the seeds had failed, and that had caused some financial loss. And I was given the task of determining for the court proceedings, first of all, the date of insolvency, and secondly, whether or not insolvency, if not for the broken seeds or the poor performing seeds, that would have changed the company's date of solvency. For the first position, though, of the date of solvency, that business showed all the typical indicators of a business that was going into insolvency: deteriorating financial position, negative balance sheet, deteriorated financial position, but it did have a relatively solid balance sheet position a couple of years before the losses started. And what they'd done was they had progressively been able to borrow more money from their financier. Now that made Big Four financier had continued to support them, had extended overdrafts, had allowed them to take some more term debt. And because of that, despite the deteriorating financial position, because of that financier's support, we considered that they remained solvent for that period. They had that financier's support. But the ultimate decision for that one that changed it from solvent to insolvent and gave me the date of solvency was when the bank finally said to them, we're no longer going to provide you any further support, and the extension to your overdraft, we're now going to require you to repay that back to normal terms at the end of the extension period. And when they had no possible way of doing that, from that moment that the bank withdrew support, that was when they were insolvent. And I think that's an important point to remember for financiers generally, is that for a lot of these directors, and while I just gave you an example of a retrospective case where we were looking back at insolvency, a lot of directors though in real time now are coming to us and asking for our advice around whether or not, once the moratorium rolls off, will they be solvent or insolvent? And do they have to avail themselves of things like safe harbour? And one of the key issues in all of that discussions is what's happening with your bank. If the bank keeps providing you with support, and that support may simply be that they're not actually providing you, and they're not going to enforce the securities. But what the bank's doing is quite important. Now, I won't go into it any further because I know Matt's going to talk about that shortly, but that's what I wanted to cover in terms of those other INDICIA tests. This slide we've got up here just gives you a real life example of how we usually look at these things. Very briefly, we use a traffic light system. Green is good, red is bad, yellow means there's some issues. And in this particular one, without going through line by line, we identified the key items that could be influencing solvency on the left, and then we assessed them as the level of risks. And in this particular case, as you can see, I actually worked on this job and I can tell you that we called them solvent in the end. While there were some risks in there, none of them on their own were enough to change the fact that they were solvent. So I hand over to, I think, Matt. You're going next.
No, mate, you've jumped the gun. I'm just going to quickly talk through solvency issues as we're unfolding in 2021. As you touched on there, obviously directors have been trading under the benefit of the insolvent trading moratorium, which runs out at the end of this year, and they're now starting to come to us talking through, what happens next year? Am I going to be okay? How do I get comfort regarding solvency? And as you touched on, obviously financier support is key. So again, some of the issues that we've talked through, that the legislated credit support for 2020 is going to tail off: rent relief, bank relief, trade credit limitations on enforcing debts. The ATO's attitude is going to be a big one. All of that has just basically been on hold for this year, but it's going to unwind next year. The balance sheet, is already congested with those liabilities. How does that play out in solvency? And obviously, lenders needing to take that view as to, how do I support my borrowers through this? Can I support my borrowers through this? And should I support my borrowers through this? We've got the difficulties associated with forecasting just because of the unprecedented nature of where we are. Historical analysis is less relevant. Still going to be necessary, but less relevant, purely because, the world has changed materially. Forecasting is going to be a challenge because we've got an unprecedented situation. There could be another lockdown. You're going to have increased in bad debts. You could have the opportunity, it could be the instance of multiple bad debts occurring in an industry simultaneously, particularly if you look at specific sectors: hospitality, tourism, education, those sort of things. So, we've got concerns for certain of our clients where they're exposed because their credit balances, their debtor balance has grown significantly by virtue of the moratorium around stat demands. That, if there is a particular issue in that industry, whilst their core business might be okay, the collectability of those receivables is going to be severely compromised, and that will then impact on the solvency of those businesses. So you've got the potential for that to snowball, but you can't forecast it because who can say what's going to happen? You've got the historically low levels of insolvency during 2020, as we've touched on throughout this. There hasn't been the trigger to force directors into making the decision to put their business into administration or liquidation. Notwithstanding the fact that Australia's got some of the most onerous insolvent trading laws in the world, those haven't come into play. And it's not really about the outcome. It's not really about pinging a director for insolvent trading and saying you've done the wrong thing and you're on the hook now for this liability personally. It's about the behaviour which it drives, which is getting directors to put up their hand and acknowledge when the time is over. And that just hasn't happened for the last 9 months. I mean, Mathew's got the statistics on it, but it's something enormous, like it's 60% down or 70% down on prior year. So even in a normal environment, you would expect those businesses which would have normally put themselves through a process to work their way through in 2021, notwithstanding a pandemic, notwithstanding the recession, notwithstanding the global issues associated with geopolitical stuff, Trump, China, that kind of thing. So a massively complicated year up ahead. Solvency, as we've touched on, is going to be key. Shaun touched on the fact that safe harbour may well become increasingly relevant. That doesn't really help you as lenders because you need to make that decision around working capital, around extending facilities, around covenant waivers, and that's how it's going to be tough. Really? So that's all I wanted to say on solvency issues for 2021. I'm now going to pass back to Mathew, who is going to talk about bank actions.
Thank you. So just being mindful of time, but obviously very important topic here. So I'll talk through the beginning, middle, and end of the impact of the bank, and firstly I'll start off with talking about directors and that flow and effect there. So insolvency is relevant from an insolvent trading perspective. If a director is trading a company whilst insolvent, then they can be held personally liable to compensate the company. So that is to say, all the debts incurred that they can't pay after the date of insolvency, that amount they may have to compensate the company for. So naturally, a director's got a level of self-preservation in mind, and that insolvent trading will then impact on their decisions. So from a bank's perspective, if there's a director who's behind the wheel of a business, and he may be inclined to put the brakes on pretty quickly so he doesn't expose himself personally. So that can have a dramatic effect, because the bank will invariably have a security over the business, and if the business isn't a going concern, then that can be very detrimental to the value of that security. And then, so what happens then is when a director is presented with that issue, they may go to their financiers and say, I've got this problem. It could be a short-term issue, could be one of the many deferrals we're seeing at the moment due to business restrictions, and or it could be that they're promising the pie in the sky turnaround. So they'll rattle the tin with the bank. Now, if a business is in financial distress, the bank will inherently be more wary of handing over any funds to them. So it's a bit of a catch-22 there. So a director can continue to trade with the bank support, but the bank may be less inclined to support them. Now, when that occurs, the bank might need to think about, well, what's our exposure here? Do we think that if the director ceases to trade the business, then what would a forced sale look like, or what would a liquidation sale look like? And then what would the shortfall be to the bank? Do they have enough security? A bank might be comfortable that they've got security over the personal home of the director as a backup there, and there might be plenty of equity, so it may not be as much of a concern to them. Conversely, they may be a bit worried, and they might be more inclined to help the business turn around the situation and finance them through it. So at that stage, they might do some freelance IAs to look at assumptions of business improvement and the like. So I'll cover off on the next slide some of the more specific examples of what can occur. So then a business and a financier, they might be at the fork in the road there, where if they've got the support, then they'll push on. If they don't have the support, then they may cease trading. Now, when assessing the solvency, these are some of the specific things that we'd look at. Again, with 2020 hindsight vision, but the decision not to enforce, to grant an extension, or to allow a restructure, or more rarely a discount, obviously favourable outcomes for a company and can improve its solvency. Conversely, on the flip side, if they don't agree to provide further finance, and then if they're not even being responsive, this can be seen as an indicator of insolvency, and present that problem where, well, a director may cease to trade. If this is occurring for a lender, they would really want to check the validity of their security, because under a liquidation scenario, that can get there's an impact there if it's not properly registered. So at this time, that's when they should just make sure that they're happy with their security. So whilst a lender may be there doing any of these half a dozen actions, you might not be aware of what that flow-on effect is to the director and their thinking, and therefore the value of the security. So think about how a director will consider different situations. At that stage, a financier may request additional security, which can be quite telling, because if, for instance, a director / shareholder doesn't want to put up their personal home because they don't think the business is trading well enough, that probably tells the financier a story in itself. But is that an option? And then I've already talked about some of the for sale impacts. And if there is a greater exposure, what we see is that the lender will be perhaps a bit more patient and will try and work with the client, may appoint a restructuring expert to try and either get a full recovery of their security through an exit scenario, or improve the return. And then just finally, I'll talk about the end consequences there in a liquidation scenario. Can you flip over? Thanks, Duncan. I've already talked about how a director will want their own comfort, and then, you know, understanding the bank's position will influence that. And then, you know, some of those favourable outcomes that needs to be weighed up by the bank, and whether they're going to help out the director in that regard. Now, if ultimately the company can't prevail from its insolvency, not just a temporary lack of liquidity ends up in, say, a liquidation scenario or a receivership, then a liquidator will conduct an analysis, and it'll be through all the methods we've already spoken about today, and we'll then be able to pinpoint a time when this company was insolvent and it should have ceased to trade, and therefore the directors could become personally liable for it. So that flows on to that claim against the director. And then again, I've already covered off on how in a liquidation scenario, if a security is not perfected, then it can vest in the company. So if a company is heading in this direction, the process of registering those securities and those underlying agreements becomes particularly important. Now, some of the larger financiers will be quite well versed in how they register their general security agreements or PIMSs, but you really want to make sure that all of those registrations are in order and before that scenario hits. Now, when we conduct this analysis, although every situation is different, but going through cash flow tests, balance sheet tests, and all those other insolvency indicia, you can quite often tie the date of insolvency to when the financier support was lost. If I revert back to that cash flow example I was referring to earlier, if a company had a $500,000 overdraft, and then they were defaulting on their finance arrangements, and the bank then called up that overdraft, it becomes a pretty clear date of when the company became insolvent. All of a sudden, it didn't even have the $500,000 overdraft that it needed. So, whilst the financier may not always need to be fully aware of all of these other methodologies, it can have a great flow-on effect there, and they should perhaps be aware of those other perspectives there of what happens with the director, and then that insolvency analysis that could occur later in the piece. Yep, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So I guess at the end of all of this analysis that we've been through, the cash flow test, the balance sheet test, the INDICIA test, we have to come up with an opinion, and that's basically either your liquidator or an insolvency expert, independent expert saying, right, on this date, it was insolvent. I'm really not going to get into it any more than that. It's basically an assessment and a summary of everything that we came across that we've covered in the last hour. So I guess in terms of questions, there was a question prior to us, before the thing kicked off, as to how the lenders are responding to solvency and the challenging time that we're in. Are all lenders acting equally, etc.? And I guess the answer is that obviously all of the lenders are grappling with how to best support their customers through this process. It's a completely different concept to the GFC when it was a group capital crisis. This is not a capital crisis. This is a virus, and lenders are by and large looking to support their businesses, support their borrowers. And we're finding each of the big banks and the second tier lenders are all responding in a slightly different way, but nobody is looking to push the red button and enforce. Everyone is looking to be as supportive and cooperative and work with their borrowers through this process, which is obviously a sensible and rational and reasonable approach to take. So everyone's structuring their teams and their response slightly differently, but it's all designed to support and help the borrower. And there's I guess an acknowledgement that zombie companies are out there, and that they are, they would have left the economy over the course of the last 12 months, but for the government stimulus. There's the acknowledgement that there are businesses that aren't going to recover from COVID, and that they will exit the economy over the next 12 months. There's an acknowledgement that banks aren't going to be able to support everybody, and that they're going to have to pick who they do and who they don't support. But it's not being a rushed process. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. It's a very considered and thought-out process, and that's something that we look to help the lenders with in terms of making that decision around who do you support, who don't you support. And solvency, cash flow, balance sheet is one of the very important factors in making that decision. Are the challenges that the business face surmountable, or are they too far gone? Is their balance sheet too congested with liabilities that, with the best will in the world, the business is not going to be able to get out from underneath? So that's where we see ourselves. In the last couple of minutes of the session, I've got a current example. I'm working for the business, balance sheet deeply insolvent. From a cash flow basis, it's okay because you've had the JobKeeper benefit, you've had the return to normal trading conditions to a point. So you've got the sort of two conflicting tests. The lender is happy to sit in there and work with that borrower to see whether the cash flow test can continue to improve, whether they can get that uplift, in which case the fact that they're balance sheet insolvent is less relevant. But on the flip side, I'm working with another lender who has got a business which is balance sheet insolvent, it's cash flow insolvent, but for JobKeeper, and its balance sheet is so congested that then they would need a massive increase in turnover to allow a return to normal trading, consider a return to covenant compliance. And the lender is not going to help that company. They're going to give them time, but they're not going to give them more facilities. And I guess that's the decisions that we've got to make and got to work with. So we'd like to wrap up on that point. Our next session will be in January. It will be on the topic of voluntary administrations. And we would love you all to join us. If you've got any questions from today's session or anything in relation to anything else that we've covered off on these topics, please let one of us know. Shaun in Brisbane, myself in Sydney, Mathew in Melbourne. If you found Shaun more interesting and you're in Sydney, feel free to call him. And on that note, I'd like to wrap up and thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.